Hi guys, welcome to today's that didn't work. Let's try again. Welcome to today's econs videos. We're going to be looking at GDP today. So on your screen, you'll be able to see that I've got a few kind of key statements, our learning objectives. We're not going to look at the calculations in this video. I'm actually going to link a video on how to calculate some of the GDP stuff because I don't believe in reinventing the wheel, and there's some really good explanations out there. But we are going to be talking through the distinguishing, examining, evaluating stuff. So if you have any questions, just let me know. You can always rewatch this video, slow it down, etc. So let's get into it. Hopefully some of this is fairly familiar to you already because you'll have done this, you'll have done the pre-reading. I'm just going to make me move down a little bit. You'll have done the pre-reading in Cognity, but sometimes there's the little nuances that get lost. So just do make sure you are listening to this video carefully, just so you can clearly distinguish between it. But basically what we're talking about with gross domestic product is the measure of all our final goods and services that our country is producing within a particular time frame. And we'd normally be generating GDP perhaps quarterly, so every 3 months. And that's sort of the general publication of those bits of data. It's worth noting, though, that getting that data, GDP is calculated quarterly, but it's always behind. So, for example, you wouldn't be able to get necessarily the GDP figures for the last quarter right now. You probably get them maybe 6 months ago, depending on where you're talking about too. Obviously, some countries measure GDP more effectively than others and more often, and lots of factors can disrupt the measurement of GDP. But what we're going to talk about today is how we measure it. And how useful it is as a measure. So let's start with the calculations that I said we weren't going to talk about. This calculation we are going to talk about. So there are 3 ways that you can calculate GDP. You can use an expenditure approach, an income approach, or an output approach. Now, the only method you will ever have to use to calculate in a paper 3 is the expenditure approach, okay? So I want to get that out there right now. You will never calculate using the income or the output approach in this course. However, you could be asked a short answer question in a paper 3 or even a 10-mark question asking you to discuss or explain the difference between them. So it's important that you know the fundamentals of each approach. So I'm going to start with the expenditure approach because that's what we're going to use the most when we talk about GDP. And this is basically a measurement of the spending that is happening in the economy. It's working on the principle that spending equates to output. Now, the thing to think about here is we are talking about spending on final goods and services. We are not talking about the spending that firms do on raw materials. So, they buy this to make that and then you buy it. We're talking about final output levels. And when we calculate it using these 5 elements, okay? So we have our consumption, our consumer spending, investment, government spending, and then export revenue minus import spending, okay? Now, this should sound kind of familiar because it's just like our circular flow. I'm actually going to go back on my screen, right up to the circular flow, to our 5-sector model. There we go. I'm just going to minimize me down. All right. So if we were to look at this and use it to help us calculate GDP, it's really easy to find the elements. We have our consumer spending right here. Okay. Households to firm consumer spending. We have our investment. We have our government spending, and we have our net exports over here with our export revenue minus our import spending. Okay. And that is our GDP calculation coming straight out of our circular flow. Now, don't do that. So if I come back, oh, I went way too far then. Let's try going to slide 10. So when we look at this expenditure approach, it's pretty straightforward. It's relatively simplistic, but it gives us a general picture. Okay, and something I want to highlight with all of these figures when we use country measurements is that they're designed to be used to measure trends, to measure change, not necessarily as effective measures of overall picture and accuracy, okay? So we want to know if GDP is going up, if it's going down, And as long as we use a consistent measure, we can do that. The actual meaning of a particular GDP figure may not be so helpful, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. So our expenditure approach is where we spend money. The alternate way of looking at it, another way to calculate it, is to use our income approach. So instead of considering the spending and the investment and the government spending, this is where we look at all of the income moving around that flow. So income for the factors of production, our rent, our wages, interest, profits, and we add to that business taxes because those taxes reflect output that's not already counted, okay? And we also include fixed capital consumption. So that's where the business spends on major capital infrastructure in a year, okay, or in whatever the time period is. So this income approach, if we were to calculate it, should equal our expenditure approach. Fundamentally, they are the same thing, okay? One is the money going out, one is effectively the money coming in, okay? So that would be our income approach. The last option we have is the output approach. And this is simply considering the output coming out of an economy. So each level of output. So if I buy wheat from the farmer, that's counted. If I buy bread from the baker, that's counted. But obviously there is a problem measuring these units because the baker bought the wheat and then sold the bread, but we've just double counted. And you don't want to do that. So what the output approach does is it considers the level of contribution at each level of production. So if we consider the baseline, the farmer who grows the wheat, and he sells the wheat, there's step one, and the contribution at that point is what he sells it for. Okay, it's raw, it's gone. The baker then makes it bread, and the baker will sell it for more money because obviously he wants to make some kind of profit. And so the contribution at this point is the difference between what the baker spent and what he now sold it for. So that gets added, okay? And you can see here that actually if we just measured the consumer spending, what the person bought the bread for, we'd get the same number, okay? And that's fundamentally why they're all alternate options, okay? They all end up at the same point. We use expenditure because it's the most direct, it's easiest to get the most accurate figures, and it doesn't have potential problems like the output approach does, where sometimes determining the contribution can be hard and things still occasionally get double counted. So it's really messy, okay? And you need to know a lot about each level of sale that's going on. Whereas with the expenditure approach, it's quite easy. Businesses report their earnings, governments know what's being spent, banks have to report investment levels. That information is easily available and collated into that figure. So any three is appropriate. Generally speaking, the expenditure approach is preferred. So let's talk a bit more, though, about our expenditure method. So I said that consumption is all spending on goods and services. That was easy. Investment, though, isn't just the firm's spending on capital goods, okay? It isn't just money going into that. It's also if households spend money on major purchases like housing and new construction. And the reason for that is because those major purchases increase in value and have resale value. Okay, they're significant and they will be transferable later. So we consider it an investment to have purchased that. Government spending, again, generally easy. It's the spending on salaries and capital goods. But you need to note it does not include transfer payments. So transfer payments are the payments that governments make to support the community. So that's payments like pensions to the elderly, disability pensions, welfare for people who are unemployed. That does not get counted because it's not considered output. Our economy isn't growing because of that money. That money may then go and get spent on goods and services, and that gets counted in consumption. But when the government gives it to the people, we don't count it, okay? And then lastly, of course, is our net exports, and that's really straightforward. It's your export revenue, so what people are spending on the exports you're sending out, minus the import spending, that should say, not revenue, spending. Okay, so basically whatever your country is spending buying imports in. Now, I know it's annoying having it being X minus M, but I was already taken and E gets used for so many other things in economics. I assume they thought it was not appropriate. So just remembering that that calculation is GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. All right? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about why measuring growth is important. It's important for three fundamental reasons. The first one is that information is important, it's powerful. Having good information, particularly about an economic level of health, equates to political power and influence. Basically, if you can effectively tell people and know what an economy is doing, you can predict future actions, you can forecast decision making, okay? And you can use it to promote yourself or hurt your opposition. Look at the economy falling, it's their fault, okay? It's also important though, just for the sake of knowing economic performance. Remember I said that the figure isn't itself helpful, but as a comparative over time, it tells us, are we getting better or are we getting worse? And this is important, and we all respond to this information. Consumers respond by changing their spending habits. Financial institutions and firms change their investment levels when they know more about economic performance, okay? We all, even if we don't know it, make decisions based on the health of the economic sector. So knowing about having a simple, comparable way to measure economic performance over time is really important. And lastly, of course, and probably the most important reason for measuring growth is that it helps with policy making. You can't make good economic policy for your country unless you know how your country is doing. And again, being able to measure over time, having a figure that you use and you use consistently, but also a figure that other countries use and use consistently, so you can compare with their levels of growth. Helps you as a policymaker know, firstly, do you need to take action? And then if you're taking action, is that action working? Do you need to make changes? Okay, so it guides that policy decision, okay, in that process. But it's not the only figure out there. We don't just have GDP. It's the one we probably use the most, or historically have used the most, but it's not alone. So we do have one called Gross National Product, or GNP. And this kind of taps into a weakness of GDP. So GDP measures your flow of income within your borders, regardless of whether that money is staying in your border. And I don't mean like, oh, but people might spend overseas. Okay, we do factor that in through our import spending. But more along the lines of, you might have people who invest overseas or own businesses overseas that they're getting money from that you're now not counting. Or you might have foreign businesses owning operations and sending money back from those operations to their home countries, and you're losing. So your GDP picture can't factor in this international engagement with your country. It can only tell you a picture of your domestic borders. Now, for lots of countries, that's fine. Their gap between their GDP and their GNP is quite small, because they don't have a huge portion of their population operating financially outside of their borders, and they don't have a huge foreign population operating financially within their borders. But that's not true for everywhere. So that's where figures like GNP come in. So the gross national product measures our flow of income within our borders. It takes GDP, but it then also considers net property income from overseas. So money coming in the form of dividends, interest, profit. Basically, firm investment. So you live here, you're a resident here, but you have an overseas business venture that is giving you money. You're getting money from that. Or you've got assets that are giving you money. And we can now count that. But you can also count what's going out. Now, what's important about this, though, is that gross national product counts only citizens effectively. It focuses its calculation on the people who are citizens of the country and their earnings, which means it sometimes misses the spending of resident non-citizens, which is where GNI comes in. So our gross national income is very similar to GNP. In fact, when I was thinking about how to explain it to you today, I actually had to do some Googling, because every year I struggle with this explanation. And I spent the better part of an hour looking for a decent way to explain this again, because they're really, really similar. But the key difference is that gross national income can factor in, it can distinguish between when people are earning an income and sending it overseas, and when they're earning an income and spending it locally. okay? It's considering not just who's receiving the funds, but also where it's being spent. And this is important because sometimes it's being repatriated. So if you think of domestic workers in Singapore is a great example of this. They live here, okay, but they don't spend a lot here. They repatriate a lot of their money back to their home countries, to their families. Other expat workers, however, live here, but a lot of them spend a lot of their income here, okay? It's a bigger part of their life, and this is a more fundamental living space for them. So gross national income is slightly varied in that regard. In terms of what you need to be able to express for your IB program, really what you're saying is the difference between GDP versus GMP/GNI, okay? Because GMP and GNI are fundamentally very similar. They're factoring in that external flow of income, while GDP doesn't. It only looks at the domestic. And that's the difference you need to highlight if you're asked this question. The distinction between NP and NI is less important, but I just wanted to make some attempt at making it clear to you. So, aside from the fact that we don't just have GDP to use, we also don't just have one version of GDP. Sorry, my brain went then. So, GDP can be altered to correct some of the things that are maybe errors with it. The first one being that GDP on its own is a raw figure that doesn't factor in inflation. So if I think about let's use a really simple number. So if I think about what $10 would buy me today, it won't buy me an enormous amount. In fact, the cup of coffee I bought at Starbucks yesterday cost me like $8.20. So my $10 is not going very far. But 100 years ago, that $10 would have been my salary for 6 months, okay? And it would have paid for food and all sorts of things. Now, maybe not quite. I probably exaggerated a little bit there. But you get the gist, okay? So measuring the fact that we've gone from an average GDP of maybe 3 million a year to 16 billion a year isn't helpful because we need more money. The money is worth less, so we need more of it. So this is where there's nominal and real GDP. So nominal is that raw figure. If I just look at it now, how much are we bringing in this year as a number? Real GDP allows us to consider the effect of price level changes. So it takes a fixed baseline, so that it takes a point 10 years ago, and then normalizes it across so that we can see GDP relative to the change in inflation. Now, we are going to look at how we use a calculation to calculate nominal and real GDP, and like I said, that's something I'm going to share with you later. But for right now, you just need to know that nominal is raw GDP without any consideration for anything, and real GDP is GDP that has been adjusted to reflect price changes. Alongside those two, we also have the option to calculate per capita GDP. And this is important when we start to look at how countries use GDP to compare with each other. Because logically, it makes sense that if a country has more people, it will produce more, and therefore its GDP will be higher. But that doesn't necessarily tell us much about their economic health or growth level if, for example, their population is massively increasing and their GDP is not. So we're interested in knowing actually, well, how much GDP are they producing per person? Now, I want to be clear, this does not tell you about the necessary wealth level of the population, okay? Because it's entirely possible that most of the wealth is held in a very small portion of the population at the top. We see this in lots of places. But it gives us a better idea of that country's capacity to cope with its population. So this per capita GDP calculates our GDP relative to our population size and therefore then makes it comparable to different countries, okay, irrespective of how big they are. The third model of GDP we have is green GDP. And what this tries to do is factor in environmental damage and degradation. So it's all great for a country to be massively producing, having huge industrial outputs, exporting billions of dollars of stuff overseas. But if to do that, it's polluting its atmosphere so badly that asthma levels are rising, that there's more people being hospitalized, that there's shorter lifespans, that resources are being overused, so they're not going to even be available in several years' time. We started to recognize that GDP without those factors doesn't necessarily help us. So GDP tries to create a price for that environmental loss, okay? And then subtracts that loss from the GDP figure calculated. Now, it's not foolproof. It's certainly not a figure that's commonly used, I would say, in terms of country comparison or national statistics. But it's one that's increasingly being promoted. It's a bit like when we look at market failure. You know, we have the real model, and then we have, well, maybe we should be considering those other things that we ignore in free market economics. Green GDP is a bit like that. It's us saying, well, GDP is what privately as a country is good, but maybe we should be thinking about the damage so that long term we can correct the failures, okay? So I've given you some GDP measurements, and I've also talked a little bit about some that correct, but I just want to briefly talk about the problems with GDP. And there are three kind of areas where GDP has some issues. The first is that it overestimates well-being, okay? It can't tell you if the spending is spending that's happening on negative things. So let's say that your GDP grows massively because 75% of your country takes up smoking cigarettes. It's not a good thing. You've got growth, but it's not a good thing. So it's telling you you're doing really well, but maybe you're not doing really, really well. So it can't factor in those negative positives. So the things that cause problems but count as positive spending, right? It also underestimates well-being though, because it doesn't factor in all of the transactions going on. It doesn't count life expectancy, which is improving pretty much everywhere. It doesn't count the fact that there are black markets. Now, we generally think of black markets as not great things, but they are economic transactions. They are providing income to people. They are providing resources to people. So in terms of growth and benefit, they exist. They're providing genuine resource and wealth development within a group of people, and we can't count that in GDP. We don't count unpaid labor. So the resource and output of volunteer activities isn't counted, but it generates output, okay? So there's sometimes an underestimation of the well-being in the community because it's not counting in every element of the community. And of course, lastly, it just lacks a lot of information. It doesn't tell us anything really about societal well-being, about quality of life, okay? As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't consider the wealth gap. It can't tell us where that money is going. So there might be huge growth, but only 0.5% of the population may be benefiting from it. It can't tell us about environmental issues. The raw GDP, nominal GDP, can't tell us about inflationary effects, okay? Now, like I said, we've got some GDP measures that we adapt to help us overcome some of this lack of information, but it's still important to recognize that that is there, that there are challenges with that, and that we need to consider that. Now, if you want a little bit more information about each of these three elements, I have actually inserted it in the notes of these slides. So when you go back to the slides later, just make sure you look at the notes under the slide so that you can see some of the other things that fall under these problems. Okay, now the last thing I want to talk about is purchasing power parity. So a problem I didn't highlight on the last page, but it comes under lack of information, is we can't tell from GDP how far those dollars will go. So I can tell if your GDP per capita is higher than their GDP per capita, but their GDP per capita might go a lot further in terms of what it can buy. So for example, if I want to buy a block of cheese in Singapore, that's a good example, a block of cheese in Singapore, that block of cheese, like real cheese, that's going to cost me upwards of $6 to $7 starting point for that block. Now, that same block of cheese at home in Australia will cost me $3 to $4. So what I can buy, and remember, this is a good example because Australia to Singapore is pretty much 1-to-1 currency-wise. So the same block of cheese is costing me more dollars here, okay? And because of that, my dollars don't go as far here. Now, this is important because the GDP per capita in Singapore might be higher than the GDP per capita in Australia. And it's now occurring to me I should have checked that, and I haven't, so maybe you want to go and check that. But the point is that if that GDP per capita is higher here than it is in Australia, that may not matter if the cost of living here is higher. And this is where purchasing power parity comes in. So what we're trying to do with this is we're starting by putting everyone on the same currency level, okay? So we're calculating our GDP per capita, and then we're converting it into a singular currency, usually US dollars, okay? So on the screen, you can see a couple of tables and you can see some countries and the GDP per capita in thousands of US dollars. So that's step one. Make sure everybody's using the same currency. Because like I said with my Australia-Singapore example, you can't measure the difference in cost of living unless you're starting from the same base point. So once you've done that, you're then going to adjust based on a fixed kind of basket of goods. You're going to work out the average purchasability and cost, and you're going to adjust your GDP per capita with your purchasing power parity adjustment figure to create a better understanding of how much that GDP is actually worth. So now when you look at this figure, the GDP per capita with purchasing power parity, you're in the same currency and you're looking at it with the reflective same capacity to purchase. In other words, we're all buying the cheese together. Now, if we look at the top table, that top table reflects countries that are generally more developed, okay? And we can see that the purchasing power parity pulls down their GDP per capita. This is because in those countries, the cost of living is higher. Generally speaking, the more developed, the higher the cost of living, so the less far their dollars go, all right? Now, it didn't fundamentally change the order of their output, but it does pull them down, and it pulls some of them down a lot more than others, okay? And that's important. We can see if you look at the degree of difference between per capita and per capita PPP, you can see that some of them have really significant drops and others not so much. The lower table, however, is countries who would generally be considered to have less development. So they might be developing, or they might even be at the upper end of just hitting developed. But these countries will generally have PPPs that maybe allow them to be pulled upwards, okay? And this is because for them, you can get lots with a lot less. So even though their GDP is smaller per person, the amount you need per person is also lower because the cost of living is lower. And again, you can see here that there's some significant differences for some of these countries between what they get in the GDP per capita and what they get with PPP involved. Now, I'm going to pause at this point because I'm going to let you go off and do some calculation stuff. But like I said, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, you can get going with the next stages.